Welcome to Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse and Museum. I'm Josh Liller, I'm our historian. I'm going to give you a little tour of the lighthouse and the grounds today. Behind me is our gift shop and museum. The building was originally built in 1942 to house naval men assigned to the radio station here. They're intercepting German submarine communications during the war, getting positions on those transmissions, and recording the messages for decryption back in Washington. Over the years, it was used by the Air Force, a variety of local civic groups, and is now home to our Loxahatchee River Historical Society. We've been in Jupiter for almost 50 years trying to preserve local history, not just the lighthouse, but everything from early Native Americans to the modern changes in 20th and 21st century. Inside you can see our museum, which covers some of that history. Our history here on this site and in Jupiter goes back about 5,000 years to the early Native Americans. Hunter-gatherers lived in this area, living off the bounty of the river. People to this day still talk about how great the fishing is in the river and in the ocean, so you can imagine what it was like thousands of years ago before modern development. Here on our site we've even got a Native American shell mound going back several thousand years, from which we've recovered very old pottery, tools, the leftovers of people's meals, and it's helped us learn more about the Native Americans living in our area. People originally here were called the Hobe, at least when the Spanish arrived. That's what they called their village, and that is what we derived the name Jupiter from. Jobe, J-O-B-E, is how the Spanish spelt it. The English anglicized that into Jove, J-O-V-E, which they then substituted for Jupiter, Jove and Jupiter being synonymous in Greco-Roman mythology. And from that we got the Jupiter Inlet, Fort Jupiter, the Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse, and eventually the town of Jupiter. This is a Seminole Cheeky. We have it built for us by real Seminoles. The Seminoles are the Native Americans people usually associate with Florida, but they are not the original inhabitants. The original inhabitants, like the Hobe, their neighbors and predecessors, effectively died out in the 1700s from contact with Europeans. A lot of them were small hunter-gatherer tribes, and diseases ran rampant and just wiped them out. There was also raiding and conflict, sort of proxy wars between the English and the Spanish and the different Native American tribes on their sides. The Seminoles originally started mostly as Creek Indians who moved into North Florida, breaking away from the rest of the Creek tribe up in the Georgia-Alabama area. And these people, with small fragments of other tribes, formed a new independent group called the Seminoles. There was a series of Seminole Wars in the first half of the 19th century, as the U.S. pushed the Seminoles down the peninsula and then sent most of them to a reservation in Oklahoma. A few hundred of them did escape into the Everglades, and that's why we still have Seminoles here today in Florida. They did come to visit after the Civil War, coming to trade with the lighthouse keepers, salvage shipwrecks. They were a not uncommon sight to come into town in Jupiter all the way up until the 1930s. We did, during the Seminole Wars, have Forts Jupiter here. The first one was on Pennock Point. The second one was off of where Center Street is today, the Palm Point area. Out in what's now Riverbend Park. Part of it is Loxahatchee Battlefield Park because they did fight a battle between the Army and the Seminoles out there in 1838. These chickees were adapted from temporary hunting buildings that the Creek Indians had originally developed. The Seminoles adapted them to the South Florida climate where it's very warm, you need maximum airflow, you don't want to be living in a log cabin down here. So, wooden frame that's very sturdy, but lots of space, high ceilings, no walls to maximize air circulation. The palm fronds that make up the roof are layered on thick enough to keep the rain out, but they're something that can be easily found to make repairs or to quickly build a new one. This is a very large cheeky, what they call a teaching cheeky, an atatiki, which is the same name as their museum down in the Everglades. If it was a single family cheeky, it might only be about half to a third of the size of this, and there will be a platform about the height of these benches to help keep them up off the ground in case more airflow underneath, and then also in case it rains or there's any snakes crawling around in the dark or anything else like that that you wouldn't necessarily want to sleep in. Our historical marker here credits the original designer of our lighthouse, George Meade, who back then in the 1850s was just a lieutenant and engineer for the Army. And the Army engineers were being assigned to various lighthouse projects around the country. He selected the site for our lighthouse because he was the district engineer for Southern Florida and created the original design. His successor did make some improvements on the design, all of which we're very happy with. And both their combined efforts have stood the test of time 160 years later. On here it also lists our 7 head keepers during the civilian lighthouse era. Further research has found that we had about 70 civilian keepers because we had 1 head keeper and 2 assistants at any given time. And a couple of the head keepers, James Armour and Charles Seabrook, were here for 40 and 27 years respectively as head keepers. Their assistants had a lot greater turnover rate. And then with the Coast Guard here, we had about 100 Coast Guard keepers from the 1940s through the 1980s, as well as several hundred more people that were here on the site for other Coast Guard purposes like the Loran Station or the Naval Radio Station, their Marine Guards in the war, the Army Corps and civilian signalmen for the Weather Bureau Station, and even an Air Force tracking station in the 1950s. The lighthouse is on a natural sand hill. There have been some misconceptions over the years that it was a shell mound or some kind of Native American built feature, but we're now very confident it is natural. The hill makes a big crescent shape out through the natural area and then extends as a ridge across Beach Road and into Tequesta. The tower is still on its original location. It's made out of brick. It's double walls, so the outer wall is conical, wider at the base than at the top, and then the inner wall is vertical. Gives it great stability, a certain amount of insulation that way. There's iron stairs and a spiral staircase around the central column inside. Up at the top, the white brackets that hold up the deck are made of granite, which we're very happy about because granite is probably the most low maintenance part of that entire tower. The deck at the top and most of the lantern are made out of iron as well. We still have a first order Fresnel lens from the 1860s active in the lighthouse. There are only 13 lenses of that size active in the entire United States anymore, which is probably about at least a fifth or less of what was active at the peak of the lighthouse service. First order is the largest kind of lens, generally used for major seacoast lights like ours, where you're trying to light up a long stretch of coast to tell people to watch out and not run ashore. What reason we have for the lighthouse being here at Jupiter is because Singer Island is the easternmost point in Florida. It's also where the continental shelf drops off rapidly into the Gulf Stream and becomes very deep very rapidly. So all the shipping from the Gulf of Mexico and to the Atlantic seaboard passes through the Florida Straits, riding that Gulf Stream. They need to watch out for the shore, and then especially the southbound ships going to the Gulf of Mexico, they're trying to stay closer to shore so as not to fight the Gulf Stream. And that means once they round Cape Canaveral, they have to make sure they don't run aground here. Here in Jupiter, we are east of Cape Canaveral and east of Miami. A lot of people don't realize just how much the Florida East Coast curves on its way south. During the day, our red paint job with a black top is called a day mark. That will help distinguish our lighthouse from other lighthouses. Hillsborough Inlet immediately south of us, and the next lighthouse to the north is Cape Canaveral. They're both black and white, so they stand out quite a bit from ours. And then at night, how our light flashes. Up close, you'll see 4 distinct beams going around, 2 kind of back to back, and then a period of darkness. There are some panels up there that block part of the light as the lens rotates. So we'll, out at a distance, the beams swing by so fast that all you're going to see is a quick flash. And so you see flash, flash, dark, flash, flash, dark. So the 2 flashes every 30 seconds is our characteristic that helps identify our lighthouse at night to stand out from other lights, both other lighthouses and the various, nowadays, the modern electrical lighting along the beach as well. Back in 2008, we spearheaded legislation through Congress to have the 120-acre lighthouse reservation designated as Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse Outstanding Natural Area. That means it's protected from development and by a congressional order, not just an executive one, so it's almost impossible to overturn. The property is owned by the Bureau of Land Management. They take care of the large portion of the natural area here, and then our Historical Society continues to do what we've been doing since 1994 and beyond, through an agreement with the Coast Guard, taking care of the lighthouse and operating the visitor services here for the historical aspect of the site. The keeper's house here was gutted by a fire in 1927 and was so badly damaged they just decided to knock down what was left and not rebuild it. Besides this home, there were 2 additional wooden homes past where the picket fence is today. Both were later demolished by the Coast Guard as being unnecessary old wooden buildings. We do have one other surviving structure though here, the keeper's workshop, This was built in 1929, replacing a pump house that was about a decade old. It has a combination of a pump house for the well that was under the building, a paint storage locker, and then a general workshop space. We restored the building in 2010, and then a few years ago installed a new exhibit called Keeping the Light at Jupiter Inlet that talks about how lighthouses work, how ours was built, what the keepers did, and the stories of some of our keepers. The big tree here was not here when the house was. It was actually planted to commemorate the site of the house. This is a Ficus Altissima. It's a false banding or council tree. It started back there in the center where all the trunks come together, and then just steadily walked its way out. Roots will hang down from the branches, and when they get hold to the ground, they'll make an extra trunk, which helps support the branches and allows the tree to grow so massive. This is one of the few non-native plants that we allow to continue on the site. Fortunately, it's not an invasive plant. It doesn't really run rampant. It stays pretty much contained here. There are 34 steps up the hill here. We call that the warm-up climb. The tower itself has 105 stairs with 3 landings on the way. And then at the top, you get a nice 360-degree view of the surrounding area. We like to call it the best view in Jupiter. By the base of the tower, we have one other historic building here. That's the 1862 oil house. We have electricity now, but until the 1920s, the lighthouse had to run off of oil that they would have to ship down here, and they would store it in casks or in cans in the oil house to keep it safe against any fires. The bell here is from Pennock Plantation. When you drive around Jupiter, you'll see all sorts of things with a Pennock name on it, plus the plantation townhomes. That was the center of their operations. They were a Quaker family from the Philadelphia area who came down here just after the turn of the century, and they came down to grow ferns. Asparagus plumosa ferns were used as the background in floral arrangements. They were tropical ferns, so you had to grow them in a greenhouse up in Philadelphia. So coming down here, they could grow them outside in the ground, year-round, no greenhouses. And the railroad was nearby, so they could just pack them up on ice, ship them overnight up north. So it was a very good business for them. It was the largest employer in town for several decades. They also ran a dairy, providing raw milk to the about 4-county area. They were Quakers also meant that when they came down here to Jupiter around the turn of the century, when it was still very much a southern town with the issues of that era, they, being Quakers, had different views than many of their neighbors did, and they said, we will hire anyone to work here at Pennock Plantation. We don't care your skin color or what side of town you live on, and your wage is not going to be determined by either of those factors. So it was a bit of not just a great employer, but also a bit of a haven for soothing some of the tensions that might otherwise have arisen in the area and making things a little better. The bell was in the barnyard of the plantation. It was used to signal the lunch break, the end of the workday, and if there was any kind of emergency. The original volunteer fire department was based there at the plantation because of this bell, and then the bell was later, after the plantation closed, used at the church on Center Street, and then came here a little over a decade ago to preserve its history. This is the Tyndall House, built in 1892. It was originally built over in what's now the Palm Point subdivision. That was the Tyndall family's homestead. They were farmers that came down from Georgia via Kissimmee, had a large family. It was a typical what's called cracker-style architecture of the time period. It's up off the ground, so flood-resistant, gets some more airflow. Lots of tall windows, high ceilings, maximize your air circulation, much like the Seminole Cheeky did. And then the kitchen is a detached building out back to keep the heat of the stove out of the rest of the house, and if there's a fire, it's most likely going to be because of that wood stove, and therefore increase the chances that the rest of your house might survive. The house had been moved several times until we brought it here and restored it. And the main portion of the home is original, right down to the dade yellow pine floorboards, and then the kitchen in the back is a replica. We furnished it to around turn of the century with period correct items, some of them from local pioneers. We are currently open despite the pandemic. Current hours are Wednesday through Sunday. We open each day at 10. Last admission on the weekends is 1 o'clock. Last admission on the weekdays is 4 o'clock. We'll extend these hours when we have enough volunteers and staff to again resume more normal hours. You can always check our website, jupiterlighthouse.org, for details and the latest information. We are requiring masks. Admission will get you to the top of the lighthouse if you feel like climbing. You'll get to see the various exhibits and sites on the grounds that we talked about today, as well as our local history museum here.